Technology has come a long way, but in the face of volcanic eruptions, even the best inventions can do nothing but watch. In this video, you'll witness the 5 most devastating volcano eruptions ever caught on camera. Autumn hikes turned race-for-your-life thrillers. Crater tours that became paid human incinerators. Don't blink, it only gets worse with each eruption. Number 5. Mount Ontake, Japan, 2014. On September 27, 2014, hundreds of tourists hiked the scenic trails of Mount Ontake to enjoy the colorful autumn views and crisp mountain air. But just hours later, the otherwise easy and peaceful hike upward turned into a chaotic scramble downward, as tourists tumbled over rocks while being chased by gigantic ash plumes that choked their lungs and blinded their vision. Mount Ontake, one of Japan's most sacred mountains, draws over 100,000 hikers every year. It's a not-so-tiring hike you can finish without any special shoes or training. And by the end, you'll be rewarded with a panoramic view of Japan's heartland. Sounds like a perfect itinerary addition for most tourists. September, in particular, is the busiest month for tourism on Mount Ontake. The autumn season paints the trails with bright red and golden yellow trees after fall. There was a bit of a hiccup, though. The month prior, over 200 minor tremors caused by the volcano were recorded by seismic monitors. But this was Japan, and ground shaking was as common as afternoon rain. So, no hiking restrictions were put in place for Mount Ontake. No warnings were issued by the government. Come September 27, 2014, around 300 hikers ascended the trails of Mount Ontake with nothing but high hopes for a scenic adventure. The journey up the mountain was exactly what most tourists expected. With no risky slopes or steep climbs, they were rewarded with a crisp above-the-cloud view of the sky up top. But around 11:52 a.m., things started to turn for the worst. Those who stood on and near the volcano's summit felt an unusual blistering hot air wave. And within seconds, the volcano violently shook, emitting ash plumes with rocks that reached thousands of feet in the air. Without warning, the volcano unleashed toxic steam that was hot enough to boil water and hurled rocks at deadly speeds. Hikers on their way up or down both saw a terrifying wall of hot gas approaching. Videos caught by victims showed how people tried to outrun the ash cloud, yet failed as it moved way faster than their legs could cope with. It took no time for the ash that looked miles away to be right above people's heads. It covered their entire surroundings in gray darkness. The ash choked their lungs, and rocks tore through their skin.
It was terrifying, this man says. The rock was falling like hailstones. We covered our faces with anything we could find, but we still couldn't breathe or even open our eyes.
Hikers desperately searched to find anything to cover their faces, and made every effort to keep their eyes open despite the stinging sulfur, ash, and sharp debris. You could hear the terror, fear, and panic in their voices. Volcanic rocks the size of cars at the speed of 185 miles an hour began raining down the slopes. Even the smallest one at this speed would almost have the force of a bullet. Hikers saw or heard families getting crushed by boulders, but there was no time to grieve, as pausing would only jeopardize their own lives.
I'm so glad that I came back down alive.
For the people near the summit, it was impossible to run straight down due to visibility and choking ash. So dozens took shelter in the huts near the mountain tops. Unfortunately, though, these shelters were still anything but safe. With doors locked and people tightly squeezing together, these rooms turned hotter than saunas. Even worse, some windows on certain huts broke from the gushing winds and falling rocks. So, despite having a roof, people inside still struggled, choked on toxic ashes, not knowing when and if the gushes of ash would ever stop. The continuous ash eruption lasted for 2 hours. When it paused, some hikers took the risk to descend their way down the slopes. Others remained in the huts, hoping to be rescued. There was no telling whether or not staying was the right choice. If you were in their position, what would you have done? At around 4 p.m., the rescue operation started and lasted through the night. The scene looked more of a lunar expedition rather than an autumn retreat. No red or yellow leaves or bright, clear skyline. Only 4-foot deep ash, the stench of stinging sulfur, and airborne ash so thick you could taste it. By the next morning, officials reported that over 30 people were found dead on the mountain, fully covered in ash and debris. For weeks, rescue operations continued non-stop except for pauses when air toxicity levels became too dangerous to proceed. Occasional searches were conducted for up to a year to look for missing bodies. More than a year later, authorities finalized the death toll. In total, 58 people were confirmed dead. 5 others remained missing but were also presumed dead, bringing the final total to 63. Most suffered deaths from falling rocks at speeds of nearly 200 miles per hour. Others died painfully choked by ash. It brought horror to hundreds of people and affected thousands of Japanese in the aftermath. Mount Ontake's 2014 eruption became the deadliest volcanic disaster in Japan since 1926, shattering the belief that some volcanoes are safe not just in Japan, but around the world.
5年間ここで亡くなられた皆様の霊を慰めたいと思っていましたから、安らかに眠ってくださいということですね。
Number 4, White Island, New Zealand, 2019. Imagine visiting an island-looking volcano known for its bubbling mud pools, steaming vents, and acidic crater lake. You're taking pictures, having a once-in-a-lifetime adventure, when all of a sudden you hear a thunderous explosion, feel heat more intense than a sauna, and see a massive black cloud of ash coming from the crater just several steps in front of you. Unfortunately, this scenario wasn't just an imaginary exercise for those who visited White Island in New Zealand on December 9th, 2019. Because that was the day the volcano known as Wakari had a phreatic eruption with 0 warning signs. The day it erupted with literal tourists inside its active crater. December 9th, 2019. This was just another regular summer day for the tour guides of White Island. They knew the volcano was at a level 2 alert, but that was common. So they assured the tourists that there was nothing to worry about. As always, the first boats reached the island early. Visitors explored the crater for about an hour or 2, took photos, marveled at the sulfur vents, and were already heading back to their cruises. It was minutes away from being another successful tour, but this time, something was off. Just as the first tour groups were about to leave the island, ash and steam erupted from the volcano's crater, right in full view of the boats. The size of the plume was impossible for both tourists and guides alike to ignore. The ash cloud was starting to blanket over the entire island, and was only minutes away from reaching the boat. But unfortunately, not everyone was lucky enough to already be on the boats, with a chance to outrun the ash. Another wave of tourists had just made their way toward the crater, and by the time those on the boats looked back and saw the darkening sky, many of those in and near the crater had already been dead. At first, the rising ash clouds seemed like nothing unusual for the tourists near the crater. White Island Volcano does that sometimes. Tourists often felt lucky enough to witness gas steaming up close. However, the terrifying news was the ash clouds didn't stop. One explosion followed another, and what started as small gas bursts turned into massive black smoke within seconds. Tourists in and near the crater began freaking out and tried to outrun the oncoming waves of ash and scorching heat. Everyone panicked. Parents screamed the names of their children through the choking smoke. They could barely breathe, and all of them were covered in burning, searing pain. People's nails cracked. Their skin bubbled on the verge of falling off. Tourists were burned far worse than you'd typically see from fire injuries. Families tried to escape together, but for many, only 1 or 2 members made it to the shore. Many of those who stepped onto the island with smiles on their faces were later found dead, covered in inch-thick ash like lifeless statues. 47 visitors experienced the nightmare of the island firsthand. Most were from Australia, and others were from the US, Germany, Britain, China, and Malaysia. Among them, 22 people, nearly half, lost their lives. White Island's eruption did not cause any tsunamis, landslides, or powerful earthquakes. If it weren't such a popular tourist destination, the damage might have been brushed off. But it wasn't just a remote, uninhabited eruption. People were literally in the crater. They came to make a memory, but unfortunately, for many, that trip became their last. December 9th, 2019 marked the first deadly eruption at White Island and the final day that tours were ever permitted on this volcano again. Number 3, Mount Unzen, Japan, 1991. They say quiet ones are the scariest when angry. Turns out that saying applies to volcanoes just as it does to people. Because after lying silent for centuries, Mount Unzen woke up in a violent mood in May 1991. And by June 3rd, it unleashed a pyroclastic flow far larger and deadlier than volcanologists had expected, killing 43 people, including some of the world's most respected volcano experts. Mount Unzen is no innocent volcano. In 1792, it already caused one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in Japanese and human history when its eruption triggered massive landslides and a tsunami that killed over 15,000 people. But since then, for nearly 200 years, the volcano sat dormant. With nothing but records to remember its wrath, 2 centuries ago, Mount Unzen's reputation was overwhelmingly positive rather than fearsome. It became a tourist attraction known for its scenic hot springs and peaceful hiking trails. The volcano's danger felt like a distant memory. But as with all volcanoes, it was only a matter of time before Mount Unzen would prove again that it isn't as peaceful as it seems. In late 1989, Mount Unzen started showing signs of unrest. Its seismic activity was detected for the first time in decades. And since then, bit by bit, the volcano's activity intensified. And on May 20th, it unleashed devastating lava flows. Lava domes formed, separated, and slowly grew. But this event wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The government and volcanologists thought they had it under control. Evacuation zones were clearly marked, and scientists, residents, and the media kept close track of every development. In fact, many journalists and volcanologists deemed it was probably safe enough to camp inside the restricted areas to fulfill their duty or satisfy their curiosity. Can't be too dangerous to observe a little closer, right? Unfortunately, they were wrong. Their bold decision to ignore the restricted zones would prove fatal, because on June 3, 1991, Mount Unzen erupted far more violently than anyone was expecting. That afternoon, the ground shook for 6 straight minutes. Then, without warning, the summit dome collapsed, releasing one of the largest pyroclastic flows racing down the slope at over 100 kilometers per hour. Within moments, chaos broke out. It didn't trigger a tsunami this time, but the volcano caused deaths, chaos, and destruction far worse than anyone expected. Scientists and news crews, once calm and focused behind their cameras, sprinted for their lives. The pyroclastic flow was fast, hotter than fire, and impossible to outrun. A massive cloud of ash, gas, and volcanic rock swept through the valley. The eruption trampled nearby towns like Shimabara, and the heavy rain combined with volcanic debris to form deadly lahars, poisoning water supplies and breaking bridges. Of all the damages caused, though, the death toll was by far the heaviest. 15 members of the press, 4 taxi drivers, and several local residents were killed instantly. Among the victims were French volcanologists Katia and Maurice Kraft and American geologist Harry Glicken, who had previously survived the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. This time, though, they could not escape. You may already have seen a clip of the iconic moment of this tragedy. The people in this video were lucky enough to outrun the pyroclastic flow, but others weren't. Some suffered for days, feeling every part of their bodies burning before dying in hospitals. In total, over 12,000 people had to be evacuated. Hundreds of homes were blanketed in ash, roads were impassable, and the surrounding area became an apocalyptic landscape. To this day, some homes remain buried and have served as a haunting memorial, a tragic reminder of the day the quiet Mount Unzen finally spoke. Number 2, Mount Merapi, Indonesia, 2010-2021. Mount Merapi is a sacred site for the Indonesian locals. It is believed to be a dwelling place for spirits, a site for worship, and the center of many mythologies and beliefs. It even has a guardian. Locals call them the Juru Kunci Gunung. Apparently, they conduct peace talks with the spirit of Merapi. Let me know in the comments, do you believe in that kind of spiritual connection? But as revered as it is, Mount Merapi is equally feared. Its name literally translates to Mountain of Fire, and it lives up to it. It's the most active volcano in Indonesia, and in the 21st century alone, it has erupted 11 times. 2 of these eruptions, unleashed in 2010 and 2021, were so destructive they've become some of the worst volcanic disasters ever caught on camera. The 2010 eruption was Mount Merapi's deadliest since 1872. The eruption began on October 26 that same year. Right from the start, it already took over a dozen lives, including the Juru Kunci himself, who stayed behind to fulfill his spiritual duty. Ash plumes rose over a kilometer into the sky, and nearby villages were quickly blanketed. At that point, the situation still wasn't that bad. Locals wore masks and continued with their lives. Mount Merapi has unleashed countless eruptions of this magnitude before. But that calm didn't last. 10 days after the initial eruption, on November 5th, Mount Merapi exploded with a force far more violent than anything before. The air turned scorching hot. Animals fled down the slopes in panic, sensing the coming devastation long before humans did. Seconds later, Merapi erupted with full fury. A massive pyroclastic flow, which looks like a hurricane of scorching ash, gas, and rock, roared down the slopes of the volcano at terrifying speed, reaching up to 17 kilometers from the crater. Ash rained down like black snow. Choking plumes reached up to 55,000 feet. A dark cloud settled over central Java, and with every breath, locals could taste the ash. Within hours, over 300 people were killed, and entire villages were wiped out. The contingency plan of the government proved useless in the face of the eruption's unimaginable magnitude. To this day, you can see the aftermath of Mount Merapi's 2010 eruption. At the Museum Mini Sisa Hartaku, an actual house left untouched since the eruption still stands. Covered in volcanic ash, frozen in time like a ghost of that deadly day, proving that nothing stands in nature's way. Just 11 years later, in 2021, the mountain shook the locals' lives again. For months, the volcano released lava and ash in an unpredictable rhythm. Frequent pyroclastic flows roared down the slopes, some reaching up to 5 kilometers. Ash plumes soared as high as 2,000 meters into the sky. There were no sudden, catastrophic blasts, but for a long time, locals lived on edge, not knowing when or if the worst would strike. Luckily, no mass casualties were reported. The eruption was less intense, and this time authorities were far better prepared. Number 1. Mount St. Helens, USA, 1980. Vancouver, this is it. David A. Johnston, a US-based volcanologist, radioed as he witnessed Mount St. Helens' 1980 eruption. Mount St. Helens' eruption would then trigger the largest landslide in recorded history, reshape America's geography, result in millions of dollars in damage, and take the lives of 57 people, including David A. Johnston himself. May 18th, 1980. As usual, the day in southwestern Washington started as a clear, calm spring morning. Mount St. Helens' symmetrical snow-capped cone greeted the dawn as it always had. However, for the past 2 months, she hasn't been alone. The U.S. Geological Survey had set up monitoring posts to observe the volcano since March. After all, everything from the volcano's seismic activity to its gas emissions all pointed to one thing: an eruption was moments away. And science wasn't going to miss this once-in-a-lifetime event.
The crater is so high. If there's an explosion, it's probable that the debris, the very hot incandescent ash that would come down all sides. But right now, there's a very great hazard due to the fact that the glacier is breaking up on this side of the volcano, on the north side, and that could produce a very large avalanche hazard.
But looking back, maybe they should have just let nature be. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens went from becoming an observation site to unleashing devastating terror, which either caused people to flee in panic or just to accept their tragic death. At 8:32 a.m. on May 18, 1980, a 5.1 magnitude earthquake triggered the magma that had been pushing toward the surface since March to finally explode. And instead of shooting straight into the sky like most volcanoes do, Mount St. Helens did what scientists feared the most at the time. it exploded sideways, obliterating a mile-wide chunk of its north face and sending destruction racing outward at terrifying speed. Imagine 1,600 Hiroshima bombs detonating at once. That was the force of Mount St. Helens. In seconds, over 1,300 feet of its summit disappeared, and it blasted thousands of tons of scorching rocks, ash, and gas at the speed of 400 miles per hour. Trees were shredded to the size of matchsticks, and countless animals were incinerated before they had a chance to run. Towns up to 300 miles away were choked by thick, heavy ash that darkened the skies. Rivers were clogged with deadly slurry of melted ice, volcanic debris, and mud. Towns were flooded, bridges ripped from their foundations. In total, 57 people, including nearby stationed volcanologists, lodge owners, and residents, were vaporized or buried in debris by the volcano. The eruption of Mount St. Helens has been labeled the most destructive and deadly volcanic event in U.S. history. It reshaped not only American geology, but also the nation's approach to disaster preparedness. Some volcanoes offer warnings, others erupt with no signal at all. This just proves that no two volcanoes ever erupt in the same way. These 5 volcanic eruptions never fail to remind me how we humans are just guests in nature's world. When faced with tremors, falling rocks, and scorching heat, perhaps the only weapon we can wield against a volcano's wrath is a camera. Our last line of defense becomes filming the very thing that may consume us. Do you think that in the future we'll ever have the means to better protect ourselves from this kind of raw power? Up next, nature's fury is a never-ending cycle. Watch the next video to see how a single natural disaster devastated entire towns, claimed countless lives, and forever altered the lives of those who survived.